Working Cows Podcast, episode 320. This episode is brought to you by Farming Without the Bank.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. And this episode is brought to you by Farming Without the Bank. None of you are farming like you did 100 years ago. Why are you financing it like you did 100 years ago? The biggest part of your operation is the money that runs through your hands, and you let someone else control that. The bank gets the final say in what you get money for and when you pay it back. For many, this is a great relationship, until it's not. Farming Without the Bank shows you how you can take back the control of your money so that you can make the bank plan B instead of plan A. This is done by you creating your own banking system you own and control. To learn more, tune in to the Farming Without the Bank podcast and go to farmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book. Once you've read the book, Mary Jo will meet with you one-on-one and help you determine where and how to get started. She'll most likely also touch on some estate transition ideas, financing ideas, business growth or startup ideas, and many other things she has experience with from helping thousands of farmers and ranchers like you. So go to farmingwithoutthebank.com today to get the book and subscribe to the Farming Without the Bank podcast now. Very excited to be joined today by Representative Harriet Hageman. She is the representative from Wyoming's only legislative district, and she has been doing some great work in Washington, D.C., has a career track record of doing great work on issues like water rights and some of those things, and we're going to talk to her about some of that today. But specifically today, we're going to focus on defining what the United States of America is as it relates to country of origin labeling and on the mandatory EID issue. So very excited for this conversation, very excited to talk to Mary Jo, very excited to talk to Representative Harriet Hageman. Hat tip to Trinity Lewis for facilitating this conversation. Representative Hageman, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Clay, you bet. It's wonderful to be with you.
So we have some mutual friends. Trinity Lewis connected us, and looking forward to a conversation today with you about defining the United States of America as it relates to country of origin labeling regulations and the electronic ID as far as mandatory electronic ID for animals in this country. So I guess where I would like to start, if we could, is kind of establishing you and I's free market bona fides, if we could, because I think that sometimes when we start to have this conversation about mandating one thing or another, that this question of are you really for the free market ends up becoming part of the discussion. And I think that it's important for us to say, no, we're in favor of the free market. And I would like you to speak to that, and I'll share some of my perspective on that as well.
Clay, why don't I just give you a bit of my background and why I'm doing what I'm doing? And I think that will allow your listeners to have a better understanding of who I am and the position that I come at these issues from. So I grew up on a ranch outside of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. I am a fourth generation Wyoming. My great grandfather came to Wyoming in 1879. I still have quite a few family members in the ag industry. My brothers they do farming and ranching both, and their children are all staying in the ag industry as well. I am a water and natural resource attorney. I went to Casper College on a livestock judging scholarship. Then from there, I went to the University of Wyoming, where I received both my bachelor's and my law degree. I've been practicing law for almost 34 years, or I had been. I had to give up my practice starting in January of this year because I was elected to represent Wyoming in Congress. I'm Wyoming's lone congressional representative. So, but in my private practice, I represented farmers, ranchers, irrigation districts, municipalities, different industry groups. And much of what I did was pushing back against government overreach, especially in the last 25 years or so. So I'm a litigator, a trial attorney. And the kinds of cases I took on would be against the EPA, Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, those different agencies that have such a huge impact in Wyoming. And most of my challenges to the agencies that I just described relate to their efforts to try to control or constrain private industry. So an example of one case that I handled was representing a farmer in northern Wyoming who moved and cleaned out an irrigation ditch, and the EPA brought an enforcement action against him, claiming that irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States under the Clean Water Act. They sued. They brought an action against him. After 6 years of litigation, he was facing penalties of almost $65 million. We went to trial, and after a 2-week trial, the jury was out for 2.5 hours, and we ended up winning that lawsuit. I represent quite a few different gravel companies here in Wyoming when I was practicing. Again, against administrative agencies attempting to constrain their ability to exercise their rights and comply with the statutes and produce aggregate. I represented a gentleman down in southwestern Colorado. He owned the Gold King mine. That may sound familiar to your listeners. That was the mine that the EPA came in and blew out the mine and turned the Animas River yellow. The Yellow River, seen around the world, one of the worst environmental disasters in U.S. history, caused by the EPA. And I represented him and brought an unconstitutional takings claim against the EPA. That case is still pending. I'm no longer working on it because, again, I am representing Wyoming in Congress, so I don't get to practice law anymore. But I think that gives you a feel for what I have done in my background, in my practice. I believe very strongly in private property rights. I often say that if you can't own property, you are property. I also believe the federal government has gotten far too big, far too powerful, far too draconian, far too persecutorial, far too Marxist for my taste, simply because of the things that so many administrative agencies are doing.
Yeah, well, and I think that you get down to what's actually happening and some of the different actions that you've taken. A lot of it comes down to an unelected bureaucracy that is generally working not in the favor of the American people. Is that matching with your, I know it matches with your experience previously, but does that match with your experience since January, since you've gone to DC?
So I used to travel the country giving a speech called Regulation Without Representation. And the purpose of it was to expose how the executive branch has taken over the legislative responsibility, unlawfully and unconstitutionally so. So I traveled all over the country doing that. And I have continued beating that drum since I've been in Congress. So fortunately, one of the committee assignments that I have is I'm on the Judiciary Committee. And as far as a subcommittee, I'm on the subcommittee on administrative law, regulatory law. And the purpose of that is to try to get some reform into how regulatory agencies operate and claw back some of that power from the executive branch.
And what have been some of your main focuses in that regard with regulatory reform? What are some of the things that you're currently focused on?
Well, the two of them are some of them that we talked about right before we went on the program today. One of them is that the USDA has, it's starting in about 2011, although it was before that, but starting in 2011, they started a process, a rulemaking to try to force what they referred to then as radio frequency identification ear tags, or RFID ear tags, on all of our livestock producers. The cattle and bison producers fought back awfully hard against that, and were able to stop it. So in 2013, the USDA issued a rule, a traceability, identification and traceability rule that said that they would recognize all of our traditional forms of identification. brands, back tags, tattoos, ear tags, that sort of thing. And so since 2013, our livestock producers have been able to continue to sell their livestock across state lines using those traditional forms of identification and traceability. And the reality is that those techniques work perfectly fine. We have the highest quality, safest meat of any country in the world. So we don't have a problem to fix here. We just need to make sure that we continue to implement the program we have. Well, starting in 2019, the USDA made another run at this, and they issued a 2-page document on their website called a guidance document that by January 1, 2023, all of our livestock producers had to start using RFID ear tags, or they could not move cattle across state lines. They could not access the interstate market. Well, obviously in Wyoming, we don't have any big packers, so the vast majority of our livestock crosses the state line at some point in their life cycle. So I sued. I sued on behalf of an ag industry group and then 4 ranchers, 2 in South Dakota and 2 in Wyoming. And we were able to stop that rule. So since 2019, we have again been able to prohibit or prevent USDA from moving forward with this. By the way, your biggest advocates for this rule are your big packers, your big ranchers, and your ear tag manufacturing companies. That probably doesn't surprise anyone. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't smaller operators who want to use EID. I'm perfectly fine with that as long as it's not mandatory. If electronic identification works with your operation, have at it. I don't have a problem with that at all. If that's going to increase your return on investment, more power to you. But it shouldn't be mandatory and it shouldn't be issued from on high. So then again, in January of this year, the USDA is at it again. They issued yet another rule, and this time saying that, again, our cattle and bison owners must use EID. Now, they now refer to it as electronic identification. I think in an effort to try to get around the RFID and the state that I made about that. But now they're saying that, again, if you want to access the interstate market, you have to use EID ear tags. And so what I have done is that in the Ag Appropriations Bill, I have added an amendment to defund any effort by the USDA to enforce mandatory EID.
Yeah, very good. So is it that if I sold my cattle into a sale barn, would somebody else be able to put in an EID tag and then they could cross the state lines, or how does that work practically, or is it that well defined?
Well, it isn't that well defined, but the problem is that I'm not sure that you're going to be able to access that market, because who wants that expense the moment that they take a head of 150 head of your steers? They're not going to necessarily want to have that. They want you to do it. They want the producer to do it. So yes, I suppose that could be one technique, but keep in mind, one of the ways in which USDA is downplaying the cost of this program is they're acting as though the only thing that ranchers are going to have to buy is the ear tag itself. And so using that as their benchmark, they say, well, this is it. It's expensive, but it's only going to cost the industry $26.1 million a year. Well, first of all, that's hogwash. That number's an absolute lie, and I'll tell you how I know that. But second of all, our industry doesn't need an expense mandated from the federal government of $26.1 million. And the reason that I know they're lowballing it is because, again, they're only looking at the cost of the ear tag. They're not looking at the cost of labor. They're not looking at the cost of the readers. They're not looking at the cost of what you're going to have to do for your computer system. They're not looking at the cost for our sale barns to add all of this equipment in there to be able to move cattle at the speed of commerce, which is what they've got to be able to continue to do. So there's a whole host of expenses that they're entirely ignoring. When they did this rule in 2013, they included an estimate of what they thought a full EID requirement would cost, and it was $2 billion. So the USDA in 2013, when they were looking at this, they said, if we do a full build out, RFID across the board for all of our livestock, it would be $2 billion. Well, I will admit that this latest rule, it exempts certain animals, like it exempts animals under 18 months of age. But eventually those animals will go over that 18 months of age. And so they're going to cycle through this. So while this year you may not have to tier tag those steers, you're going to have to next year. So it's not like they're exempt forever. It's just that they're exempting them for a period of time. And again, I think it is an effort to try to downplay the cost.
Yeah. And again, back to what you said earlier, this is another way that it favors the little guy, because a lot of the costs in agriculture, a lot of the costs in ranching are overhead costs that get cheaper the more number of head you can spread them out over. So a $150,000 tractor costs $150,000, whether you've got 50 head or 5,000 head, and it gets cheaper for every cow you can add on to it, because the number of animals it requires to work it's still working, the same. So I mean, and so these EID tags, it's not just the tags, which I don't know what they cost a piece, but they're not as cheap as just a plain old ear tag. And it's the readers, and those readers cost the same whether you're scanning 50 head through the chute in one day or 500 head through the chute. So it's one of those things that we've got to continue to keep an eye on and make sure that we're pushing back on these, as you said, mandates from on high.
Well, then another thing that they are trying to avoid is that in the 2013 rule, they also were going to require that all of our ranchers register their ranches with the federal government and obtain a PIN, a premises identification number. Well, clearly there are concerns about privacy. There are concerns about all kinds of issues related to environmental groups getting that information. There are concerns about surveillance. There are concerns about proprietary information, all of that. And so there was huge blowback against USDA when they said, well, you're all going to have a PIN number. So in this rule, they say, oh, no, you don't have to have a PIN number. We're not going to make you register your ranches with the federal government. But if this is a traceability rule and an identification rule, if you can't tie that particular yearling to a particular premise, then how in the world would you be able to trace that animal and determine any other animal it may have come into contact with? So again, the USDA is playing fast and loose with the rules. They're like, oh, no, we wouldn't do that. We're not going to make you register your ranch with us. No, we wouldn't do such a thing. But the entire system doesn't work. It literally collapses if you don't have a mechanism to tie each individual head of livestock to a particular location. So here's what's also very important is that Ireland has recently adopted a mandatory EID rule. And this week I received an email of all of the different forms that the ranchers, the livestock producers have to fill out over there. And I'll tell you what, it is stunning. I can't even imagine the number of hours that people are going to have to spend just doing paperwork for compliance costs. So again, they don't have that included in the rule. The compliance costs associated with this are going to be astronomical. And I don't know to the extent that any of your listeners may watch the show Clarkson's Farm. And it's Jeremy Clarkson from England. And he's a funny guy. And I'm not vouching for the language. I apologize for the language up front. But it's him starting a farm over in England. And all of the regulations that he has to go through and the paperwork that he has to fill out and the permission that he has to obtain. There's one thing I want everybody, if they watch that show, I want you to pay special attention to. He has to have a full-time compliance officer to be able to raise 15 head of cows, 40 head of sheep, to be able to grow any kind of crop at all. He has a compliance officer that spends all of his waking moments making sure that he is in compliance with all of the regulations that they have to meet. So literally, our operations would have to go out and hire someone as a compliance officer. And keep in mind that compliance officer is going to report you for anything that you mess up, because their job is compliance. So even though you're the one paying for them, they're really working for the government. So this is another level and another expense that the USDA has entirely ignored.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, because that's where I was going to go. Is one of my favorite political commentators is fond of saying, "What's the benign, innocent explanation for this?" And where are we going? Like, what's the end goal here? And we a lot of times we don't have to wonder what the end goal is. We just have to look at other countries who've done it before us and see, oh, well, that's where we're headed. That's what they're shooting for. So do you have any other ideas about what the end goal here is?
This is about control. This is about control. Your biggest advocates for it are your packers, your big ranches, and your tag manufacturing companies. No surprise there. In fact, the advocates throughout this entire time on the very advisory committees that were working with the USDA on this, one of the primary ones worked for the ear tag manufacturing companies. So huge conflict of interest. So there's that. It is going to increase the cost for cattle producers, and it's going to increase the revenue for things like your tag manufacturing companies. The other one is vertical integration. The USDA, I believe, in large part, has taken the side of the packers and the big producers against the independents. I think you can see that in a lot of evidence of that. And so I think what you're seeing is this is an effort to further vertically integrate the ag industry or the cattle industry. They've done it with poultry. They did it with pork. And I think that the cattle producers and the bison producers are the last of your independent food producers. And so I think it's in part vertical integration. We know that Walmart has very effectively vertically integrated, from owning the ranches all the way through slaughter to selling in their grocery stores. I think this is a further effort to reduce the number of independents out there. Also keep in mind that right now we have an administration that is shockingly hostile to all of our producers across this country right now. And by producers, I mean oil and gas producers, coal producers, uranium producers, and food producers. And I think that they'd like to see the interior West cattle free. I think that they'd been talking about it for years. Western Watersheds Project, cattle free by 93. They've been talking about that for a long time. I think that this is an effort to affect how and where we raise livestock in the Western United States. And then all it does is make us more food dependent, just like they destroyed our energy independence. I think that this is an effort for this administration to substantially negatively impact our food security and food independence.
Yeah, I don't know if what the saying is, 48 or 72 hours to chaos, but you start to centralize those food supply chains more and more. And we saw kind of a glimpse of what happens with that when people went to the grocery stores and found empty shelves for the first time. And so I think that we should hopefully, the idea would be to learn from your mistakes and learn the lessons and not go down those roads of further and further centralization of these supply chains so that they become more fragile and more fragile. So I think that's a good thing. I appreciate that. Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Farming Without the Bank. None of you are farming like you did 100 years ago. Why are you financing it like you did 100 years ago? The biggest part of your operation is the money that runs through your hands, and you let someone else control that. The bank gets the final say in what you get money for and when you pay it back. For many, this is a great relationship, until it's not. Farming Without the Bank shows you how you can take back the control of your money so that you can make the bank plan B instead of plan A. This is done by you creating your own banking system you own and control. To learn more, tune in to the Farming Without the Bank podcast and go to farmingwithoutthebank.com to get the book. Once you've read the book, Mary Jo will meet with you one-on-one and help you determine where and how to get started. She'll most likely also touch on some estate transition ideas, financing ideas, business growth or startup ideas, and many other things she has experience with from helping thousands of farmers and ranchers like you. So go to farmingwithoutthebank.com today to get the book and subscribe to the Farming Without the Bank podcast now. And I guess the thing that hits me, and I'm from Western South Dakota where we have a brand inspection area, but why aren't brands sufficient? Those things stay with the animal for the life of the animal. They identify the animal as coming from the ranch that they were born on and all those things?
Again, this is I would describe this situation as the USDA looking for a solution, trying to put together a solution in search of a problem. And I always am constantly looking about what is the problem that you're trying to solve. If this is your solution to it, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? And again, we have the highest quality, safest meat of anywhere in the world. But we also have our independent cattle producers are the ones that own the ranches in the West, both in terms of fee land as well as oftentimes BLM or Forest Service leases. They own the water rights because most of the water rights in the Western United States were developed for ag purposes. So I'm a water attorney, and in Wyoming, it's first in time, first in right. Well, who first started diverting water in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s? And that was your farmers and ranchers to produce food. So when you start realizing how the real property, the water rights, and all of those things are interconnected, and then you start looking at an administration who has been overtly hostile to the production of food, to cattle production, I just think it's part of a continuation of those efforts. And so, you go back to the food security. My dad always said, if you don't like being energy dependent, you're really going to dislike being food dependent. And while this is an extreme example, many years ago, I had a case involving the country of Sudan. And Sudan is a failed government. It is a failed country. The people live in abject poverty. They have very little in terms of food or any type of the amenities that we have, just very, very poor. But it's because of the bad policy decisions of their leaders. And they started civil wars in the 70s and 80s. And by the 90s, they were putting all of their they were putting all of their citizens in refugee camps. They don't produce food in Sudan, or the vast majority of Sudan. Over 90% of the food that is consumed in Sudan is imported. So what do their leaders do whenever they want to control the masses? What do they do when they want to prevent uprisings? They starve them. That wouldn't be the first time, and it won't be the last time that political leaders and despots and dictators and tyrants have used food to control the masses. And that's one of the reasons why this is such a scary proposition, because we have the ability to completely feed not only our own country, all 330 million people here with the food that we produce, but other people around the world. Yet we have an administration that is overtly hostile, to use that phrase again, against food production.
Yeah, and that's generally the way it works. It's not about actually being able to produce enough food to feed everybody. It's about being able to penetrate the lines of corrupt governments who are interested in starving their people is really more of the issue than it is actually having the land base and the productivity to raise enough food to feed everybody. So, we can see where that ends, and we definitely don't want to go that road. What are some of the other things?
One other thing on that. Keep in mind that with the BLM and Forest Service lands, especially concentrated in the Western United States, there's really only two ways in which we can generate any revenue from hundreds of millions of acres of land. And that is either with resource production, such as oil and gas and coal, and uranium, trona, that sort of thing, or it is through grazing of livestock. And so if we're not going to be grazing livestock on our BLM and Forest Service lands, you have literally taken billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of wealth out of half of your country. And that's the other side of this, is they keep wanting to push cattle off of our Forest Service lands and our BLM lands. Just heard about today what they're trying to do over in Rock Springs. And what it does is it just leaves vast swaths of land completely fallow. They don't generate any revenue for the local communities, the local municipalities, the local schools, the states, or the federal government. And I don't know many countries that can survive when they take some of their most important resources and their assets and literally put them off limits for any kind of production. But that's what our government's trying to do.
Yeah. And what are some of the other things that you've been working on? We talked about the RFID issue. What are some of the other things that have really captured your attention in the months that you've been there in Washington, D.C.?
So recently, I just filed a bill called MCOOL, Mandatory Country of Origin Labeling. Again, it goes back to food security. We did get MCOOL through in the early 2000s. It was a bill that became a statute that was signed into law. And in 2014, they repealed it because Canada and Mexico were threatening us with the World Trade Organization challenges and complaints. So the fact is that the consumers in this country want to know where their meat is produced. They want to know that they can go to the grocery store and they're willing to pay a premium for American-produced meat. Yet going back to our packers, going back to our USDA, one of the ways they've been able to control the market and really limit the amount of revenue that ranchers can generate is by importing massive amounts of either cattle or meat itself. And as so long as the way that the rule is right now is so long as that it is packaged in the United States, they can slap a Made in America stamp on that. And that's not right. So what I've done is I've done a bill that basically for the animal has to be in the United States for its entire life cycle, or it cannot be labeled as Made in America. And then I've put some real teeth into that bill as well. For any retailer who sells a pound of meat that is mislabeled, it's a $5,000 fine. So I'm trying to make this costly for anybody who would go and actually mislabel Mexican beef, Brazilian beef, Paraguayan beef, Chinese beef, Canadian beef. It has to be in America for its life cycle. And if it is not, it can't be defined as American beef.
Yeah. And I don't think if you went out and polled people on the street and said, hey, if an animal is born, raised, and slaughtered in Brazil and then comes to America and they cut it up and package it, would you be okay with that being labeled product of the USA? If you did that man on the street poll, I can guess that the people in favor of that would be very slim.
Well, the consumers want American-made beef. They do American-produced beef. And the reason is because ours is the safest and it's the highest quality of anywhere in the world. And in fact, when we do export meat, and we export about 11% of our beef overseas, it brings a premium. It can be labeled American-produced beef in South Korea and places like that, and it brings a premium. So what does that tell you?
Right. Is that scenario that I just laid out, is that feasible under today's laws, that somebody could raise and slaughter an animal somewhere else and just repackage it here and it's a product of the USA?
As long as it's packaged here, they can slap an American-made sticker on it, and that's not right.
Right. Yes. And so you mentioned, again, the MCOOL mandatory country of origin labeling. And that's kind of where I started this conversation is, some people will raise their hand and say, well, that's not a free market. Well, my answer to that has always been, I don't think it's a free market if corporations are capable of buying for themselves special treatment from the government. So I think that's one of the problems with the free market idea.
What I would also say is that's free market in America, and I'm an America First person. So I'm not going to apologize for trying to make sure that our producers in America are the ones that are protected. I'm not going to apologize to anybody for that. I also want to say that we know that one of the ways in which the packers are able to control the livestock industry and the amount of money and the revenue that can be generated through that is if cattle prices start getting too high here, all they do is just start importing beef from somewhere else, and again slapping a sticker on it that says that it's made in America. So if they want to do that, if they want to import a bunch of beef or a bunch of live cattle from Brazil, have at it. But let's make sure that sticker says that that's where it came from, and then we'll see where the American consumer wants to spend their money. So that's the thing, is that right now we have a very distorted market because we don't have a free enterprise system, because we have stockpiled so much of our meat processing with the 4 packers. Now we're getting some smaller units here in Wyoming and in other states. I'm a huge advocate for those. I want to keep pushing for those and making sure that we have the right inspections and things like that in place. But the reality is that our market has become distorted because the packers have been allowed to become as large as they have. And then with what they do in terms of dumping meat and hamburger here from other countries, once our cattle producers start actually generating revenue and making money off of it, they slap them back by dumping meat from other countries. That's not the free market system.
Yeah, right. Well, it's the same thing that the oil companies do when we start to produce too much energy in this part of the world, in the United States. They just open the floodgates in OPEC, and then we're back to cheaper oil, which is harder for us to compete with. But the innovation or the innovativeness, if that's a word, of the American energy sector is that they have been able to continue to produce oil at a lower and lower cost, and so remaining competitive on that global stage. And so I think that the same can happen in America with the beef. But we shouldn't have to continue to be the lowest cost producer, because as we've said many times here on the Working Cows podcast, the lowest cost producer is just the last one to go broke.
That's right.
We don't want to have to compete with these companies. And I think do you see that this MCOOL regulation, do you see that would help with the issue of the infrastructure being built by the small guy bootstrapping it, and then being bought out and mothballed by the bigger packers? Do you think that would help with those scenarios that we see happen all too often? So
again, MCOOL is about transparency, and MCOOL is about making sure that we know where our food comes from. And MCOOL, I think, would make it. We had there was recently a petition. I think there were over 400,000 consumers who signed it, saying they want to know where their meat comes from, and if they know that it is American made, they're willing to pay a premium for it. So here's the fact is that that's part of the market system. Everybody just needs to have the same information. Our consumer, if they want to buy a cheaper cut of meat from Brazil, have at it. But they should know that that's a cheaper cut of beef from Brazil, and they could buy a higher quality steak from Wyoming. So again, I think what it does is it helps our independent producers to stay in the branching industry, and this generation and the next generation and the next generation, and it will forestall that vertical integration, which is what I see as being, what would I say? It's just an effort to consolidate our food supply into a couple of national and international conglomerates. You know, China owns one of our large four packers. Why do we have China owning one of our biggest four packers in the United States? I can't go over there and buy one. I can assure you of that. But that's a compromise to our food supply and ultimately our food security and our national security.
Yeah, very much. I've been involved in a lot of these discussions on both sides of the argument. I'm an unapologetic fan of the free market. We've talked a little bit about that and some of your answers to some of those objections. But one of the things that I hear a lot is that if we go down this MCOOL road, that WTO is going to allow retaliatory tariffs from other nations, and that will be make it problematic for the agricultural sector in America. And would you like to respond to that objection?
Well, again, we only export about 11% of the beef that is produced here. Now, is that an important part? Yes, it is. And I'd like to open up more markets, not limit them. But I also think that it's worth fighting for our country and our producers here. That's one of the things that I think really bothers me about that argument is it's a capitulation before we even get to make the argument. There's no question that Mexico and China and Canada and Brazil have protective measures in place to protect their own domestic producers. Again, whether it is oil and gas producers or food producers or steel producers or whatever they may be, because we are more of a free market economy and we expect our private sector to actually be successful. Now, we're messing with that with all of the electric vehicle subsidies that we're doing and the subsidies for wind and solar. And Washington, D.C. is really distorting our markets in a lot of different sectors. Historically, we have not had the government propping up these businesses and then being able to go into another country and undercut them the way that our competitors do. So if that's the road that we want to go down, then we need to be looking at the ways in which China is subsidizing their industries and attempting to undercut the pharmaceutical industry, for example, here in the United States of America. I mean, food is not and cattle and beef is not the only issue on which we have trade issues with other countries. We know that your communist Marxist countries substantially subsidize a variety of industries that then allow them to undercut our industries here. An example is Trona. Wyoming is one of the largest Trona producers in the world. That's your baking soda. That's what you need to produce glass. Well, China and Kazakhstan oftentimes will attempt to undercut. They produce it as well. They don't produce as high a quality as we do, but because their companies are party owned, are government owned, they can take losses. They can do that, and then they try to undercut us on the market. So maybe we ought to go after them with the World Trade Organization. I mean, we can get into that battle, but at what point are we going to fight for our independent producers here in the United States? And why is it that only cattle's the one that ought to take the hit? So that's one of the things I'm going to say. And I think that there are a lot of other things we ought to look at as well. Russian uranium. One of the things that they do is anytime we start moving forward with being able to produce our own uranium right here in the United States of America, you see Russia start dumping uranium on the market and trying to decrease the value of that so that it becomes cost prohibitive of producing it here. Well, let's start talking about those kinds of things. I mean, it's not just cattle, but in addition to which, I'm perfectly comfortable being completely and entirely food independent in our country. I think we ought to be moving towards that. I think we ought to be working towards it. And the reality is, with a lot of the things that are going on in the world right now, I'm always going to be America first and protect our borders and our food supply.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I think we should ask the question, like you said, it's capitulation before we even got to the table, is the WTO a just and impartial umpire on the world stage, calling balls and strikes fairly and applying the same rules to everybody? Are they? If they're not, then let's fight them, right?
Well, you know, these globalist organizations, whether it is the UN, the WHO, the World Trade Organization, let me just say I have a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to, as you say, calling the balls and strikes.
Yeah. And so if they're not fairly calling balls and strikes, then we shouldn't, as you said, capitulate before we even come to the table to negotiate. So I think that's well said, and I appreciate it. What else has captured your attention, or anything else that you wanted to share with listeners today?
Well, I'm on the Judiciary Committee. I'm on Natural Resources, where we address quite a few of these issues, although a lot of these issues are also addressed through Judiciary Committee, because that's where we address regulations and that sort of thing. So I deal with it in both of those. Probably the biggest things, some of the biggest things we've been working on since I've been back there, is attempting to hold people in this administration accountable for the decisions they've made. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had Mayorkas from the Department of Homeland Security in front of us. I would encourage your listeners to go to my website, my official website. You can just Google it, but just go to our official website and you can see my questioning of him and my statements about him. He's a tyrant. He has absolutely no regard for the First Amendment. And I would also say that he and President Biden are the two largest human traffickers and drug smugglers in U.S. history. We have over 7.5 million illegal aliens that have come into this country in the last 2.5 years. It's going to be devastating for the pockets of where those folks are going. Just yesterday, New York City announced that for all of the illegal alien children that are coming into their school system, it's going to cost them about $35,000 a piece. So for 10 students, it's $350,000. For 100 students, it's $3.5 million that they never budgeted for. And those are the kinds of costs across the country. So we grilled Mayorkas, we grilled Christopher Wray. And Christopher Wray was very dishonest when he came in front of us. We had the head of the ATF in front of the Judiciary Committee. We've brought in people to talk about the First Amendment and the ways in which the government has been weaponized against us in relation to our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly. So really, I think that kind of the oversight role of judiciary has been one of the biggest things that I have worked on since I've been in Washington, D.C. I think we're uncovering and exposing a lot of things that need to be uncovered and exposed.
Harriet, I appreciate your work there. I appreciate your time today. Anything else that you'd like to share before I let you go?
Well, I've appreciated the opportunity to visit with you and talk directly to your listeners. Thank you for that, and I hope to see you again soon.
Very good stuff there with Representative Hageman. Really appreciate her time and her willingness to come and speak candidly on these issues. So coming up next week on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking to Jeremiah Markway. And Jeremiah is a guy who's been doing sheep for quite a few years, got into it in the mid-2000s, I think, and has also been a long time just rancher and has been playing that role for his life, really, but in Missouri. And we're going to talk to him about how to add sheep to an operation, some of the things that they've learned over the years, and some of the strategies that they've been employing over the years to make it work really well for them. So looking forward to that conversation. Just put a bug in your ear if you go to markwayranch.com. They are putting on a sheep and soil health school coming up in the first part of October with Ray Archuleta. It will actually be at Ray Archuleta's place in Missouri, but it's in partnership with Jeremiah and his family to put this on. So would encourage you to check that out, and we'll talk more about that with Jeremiah coming up on the next episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.